Why you understand English but struggle to speak it. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you can understand English perfectly, but when it's your turn to speak, the words just don't come out? Don't worry, you're not alone. Today we're going to explore why understanding English is much easier than speaking it, and what you can do to overcome this common challenge. Let's start with why understanding English often feels easier than speaking it. There are actually a few key reasons for this. Passive versus active skills. First, we need to differentiate between passive and active language skills. When you listen to someone speaking English or when you read English, you're using passive skills. Your brain is absorbing information and you're processing it in real time. However, speaking is an active skill. It requires you to produce language, construct sentences, and make sure your grammar, pronunciation, and vocabulary are all correct. It's like the difference between watching someone play a sport and actually playing it yourself. The former is much easier because you're observing. The latter requires active participation. Lack of practice. Another reason is the lack of practice. Think about it. Most English learners spend a lot of time listening to English, whether it's through movies, music, or conversations. But how often do you actually get the chance to speak English? Speaking requires regular practice, and without it, even the most fluent listener can struggle to form sentences. When you're watching an English movie or listening to a podcast, you're passively taking in information. You can follow the story and understand what's being said. But speaking, that's an entirely different game. It's like watching a sport and then trying to play it for the first time. The understanding is there, but the execution takes time to develop. Fear of making mistakes. Let's not forget the fear of making mistakes. This is a huge factor that stops many people from speaking up. You might understand what's being said, but when it comes time to respond, the fear of saying something wrong can paralyze you. It's completely normal to feel this way, but it's important to remember that making mistakes is part of the learning process. Every English speaker, even native ones, makes mistakes. The key is to embrace those mistakes as learning opportunities rather than obstacles. The more you practice speaking, the more confident you'll become, and that fear will gradually fade. Mental translation. Another challenge many learners face is mentally translating from their native language to English. This can really slow you down. When you listen, your brain has time to process and interpret the meaning. But when you speak, you're under pressure to produce language on the spot. If you're constantly translating in your head, it can make speaking feel incredibly slow and awkward. The goal is to start thinking directly in English. It's not easy, but with practice, you can train your brain to bypass translation and become more fluent in your speech. Vocabulary gaps. Sometimes, even if you understand English, you may struggle to speak because of vocabulary gaps. You might know the words when you hear them, but recalling them when you need to speak is a different story. This happens because understanding words in context is easier than recalling them out of thin air. This is where expanding your vocabulary and practicing speaking come into play. The more you actively use new words, the easier it will be to recall them when you're speaking. Grammar and sentence structure. Grammar can also play a role. When you're listening, you're focused on meaning rather than structure. But when speaking, you need to think about grammar, sentence structure, and word order. This can slow you down, especially if you're worried about getting it right. The good news is that you don't have to be perfect. Communication is more important than perfection. With time, your grammar will improve naturally as you speak more. Now that we've explored some of the reasons why you might struggle to speak English, even if you understand it well, let's talk about what you can do to improve. Tip number 1, practice speaking regularly. Find a language partner, join an English-speaking group, or even talk to yourself in English. The more you practice, the more natural it will feel. Tip number 2, focus on communication, not perfection. Don't worry about making mistakes. The more you speak, the more confident you'll become. Tip number 3, start thinking in English. This will help you bypass the mental translation process and speak more fluently. Tip number 4, expand your vocabulary. The more words you know, the easier it will be to express yourself. And finally, be patient with yourself. Learning a language takes time, and it's okay to struggle along the way. Every bit of progress is a step toward fluency. Remember, speaking English is a skill that can be developed with practice and patience. Don't let fear hold you back. You already understand English, that's a huge achievement. Now it's time to take the next step and start speaking with confidence. Thanks for watching and keep practicing.